The woman's bare foot struck the rear bumper as my grandfather pulled her from the SUV. I heard the soft knock through the upstairs window, 50 yards away, and somehow that tiny sound frightened me more than her hanging arms. Walter Mercer gathered her against his chest with the practiced balance of a man lifting a sleeping patient. Then he carried her past the moonlit lawn and into the black line of trees behind my parents' house. I stayed crouched behind the curtains until Walter returned alone. He brushed leaves from his coat, closed the hatch, and stood listening to the night. I thought the darkness had hidden me. Then his face tilted toward the second floor. He found my window immediately. For several seconds, my grandfather and I watched each other across the yard. Finally, he raised one large hand and gave me the same gentle wave he had used at my parents' funeral. 36 hours earlier, I had still believed grief was the worst thing waiting in that house. My name is Daniel Mercer, and 3 weeks before that night, a highway patrol officer called to tell me both my parents had died when their car crossed a rain-slick curve. By the time I reached the county hospital, Walter was already there, sitting beneath fluorescent lights with his cane untouched beside him, as if age were merely a rumor he refused to confirm. He stood when he saw me. At 77, Walter remained broad through the shoulders, silver-haired, and almost unnervingly steady. He had served as an army medic before becoming a celebrated trauma surgeon, but none of that mattered when he wrapped his arms around me. I remembered coin tricks, a deep laugh, and Christmas visits that ended too soon. I also remembered that my mother rarely spoke about him unless I asked first. Walter handled the funeral home, the insurance calls, and every practical decision my mind rejected. He never took control away from me. He simply placed each problem where I could reach it. When we agreed to meet at my parents' rural house and sort their belongings, he said he wanted no part of the inheritance. "It belongs to you, Daniel." Then, after a pause that sounded almost shy, he added, "I would like the time with you." The house sat beyond the last streetlight, where farmland tightened into woods. On Sunday morning, Walter arrived in a dark green SUV packed with empty boxes, work gloves, and enough food for a week. We spent the day separating documents from photographs and donations from things neither of us could bear to touch. He asked about my job designing medical software, listened without interrupting, and remembered details I had mentioned only once at the hospital. That evening, Walter cooked stew while I cleared my mother's desk. He moved through the kitchen with the clean economy of a surgeon, never reaching twice for the same tool. Over dinner, he told me about Evelyn, the grandmother I had never known. She was a public school librarian who repaired damaged books at the dining table and sang badly whenever she was happy. Walter smiled as he described her, and for the first time, I understood how lonely he had been. The smile disappeared when he mentioned the night Evelyn died. Walter's spoon stopped halfway to the bowl. "Your mother told you it was a drunk driver," he said. I nodded. His eyes fixed on something beyond my shoulder. That was the story we gave her. Before I could ask who we meant, his jaw tightened. A man took Evelyn from me. Calling him a man is more kindness than he deserves. Walter seemed to hear his own words only after they were spoken. He apologized, pushed back from the table, and checked his watch. It was nearly 10. He said he needed to drive into town for supplies, though we had bought groceries that afternoon, and the nearest stores would already be closed. I almost challenged him. Instead, I watched him collect his coat and keys, telling myself that an old widower had the right to grieve in private. After his SUV vanished down the gravel drive, I carried a box of family photographs upstairs. My childhood bedroom faced the back lawn, though the room had belonged to guests since I left for college. Sleep would not come. Every pipe settling in the walls sounded like a careful footstep. Around midnight, an engine rolled through the trees without headlights, and the green SUV stopped beside the detached garage, rather than in its usual place near the porch. Walter climbed out and scanned the windows. He opened the rear hatch only after the yard remained still. From my angle, I first saw a pale hand, then dark hair spilling over the bumper. The woman wore a gray hospital uniform. Her head rolled when Walter shifted his grip, but she never reacted. He did not carry her toward the house, the road, or his phone. He crossed the lawn and disappeared with her between the pines. Minutes passed before he returned. That was when he looked up and waved. I stepped away from the glass so quickly that my shoulder struck the wall. No footsteps came upstairs, no door opened. Walter entered the kitchen below me, ran water for less than a minute, and moved quietly through the house. I sat on the floor with my phone in my hand, unable to decide whether calling the police would save a woman or accuse the last family I had left. By dawn, I had built and destroyed a dozen explanations. Maybe the woman had overdosed. Maybe Walter had found her injured. Maybe I had mistaken exhaustion for death. None explained the woods. I dressed with my car keys in one pocket and my phone recording from the other. Downstairs, bacon hissed in a skillet. Walter stood at the stove in a blue shirt with the sleeves rolled precisely to his elbows, humming the tune Evelyn used to sing badly. He greeted me without surprise and set 2 plates on the table. I chose the chair nearest the back door. Walter noticed. His gaze moved from my untouched coffee to the mud drying along the cuffs of his trousers. "You saw me," he said. It was not a question. My mouth went dry, but I forced the words out. "I saw the woman." Walter turned off the burner. Then he sat across from me and said, "Good. We should begin with what I did not do. I did not murder her." Walter folded his hands on the table. "She was dead before I brought her here," he said, "and she was not human when she died." I stared at him, waiting for the lie to become more reasonable. It did not. He told me the woman's name was Marissa Cole, a night nurse from the county hospital. According to Walter, Marissa had stopped being Marissa months earlier, though her co-workers, her landlord, and even her sister still believed otherwise. I asked how he could possibly know that. Walter looked toward the back windows, where morning fog pressed between the trees. "Because I have spent 32 years finding them." His voice held no pride. "Some wear people you would never notice. Some choose people with access, authority, or trust. They remember what the body remembered. They know birthdays, passwords, private grief. But they do not feel any of it, unless pretending helps them survive." The explanation was too polished, too complete. I stood, keeping the table between us, and told him we were going into the woods. If there was a body, I would call the police. If there was no body, I would still call them and tell them exactly what I had seen. Walter accepted this without argument. He took his coat from the hook, left his phone on the counter, and walked ahead of me through the back door. The path began behind the garage, where wet grass gave way to pine needles and exposed roots. Walter moved without his cane, following a route marked only by bent ferns and shallow impressions in the earth. After 200 yards, he stopped beside a fallen oak. I saw disturbed soil, a gray scrap of fabric, and a dark stain across the leaves. There was no woman. There were no drag marks continuing deeper into the forest. The trail simply ended. I crouched near the stain but did not touch it. The air carried a faint metallic smell, and something else, like dust after a lightning strike. Walter pointed to the gray cloth. "Her uniform," he said. The fabric had been cut cleanly at one edge, yet its loose threads curled inward, as if burned without heat. When I raised my phone to photograph it, the screen flashed white, filled with static, and shut itself down, despite having a full battery. Walter watched my face rather than the phone. That happened the first time too. I accused him of planting the cloth and using some device to interfere with my phone. He nodded as though my suspicion pleased him. "Good. Keep trying to disprove me." Then he stepped around the fallen oak and uncovered a glass jar hidden beneath a flat stone. Inside floated a black object, no larger than a plum seed, suspended in cloudy preservative. The object seemed ordinary until I leaned closer. A thin membrane pulsed around it, not rhythmically like a heartbeat, but in response to my movement. When I shifted left, the membrane tightened on that side. When I stepped back, It relaxed. Walter said, every outsider carried something similar near the left temporal lobe. He called it a seed, because no better name had survived the years. It anchors them here, he said, and it remembers being watched. I wanted to leave the jar in the woods, drive away, and let distance return the world to normal. Instead, I asked where Marissa's body had gone. Walter replaced the stone before answering. When the seed is destroyed, the connection collapses. The borrowed body disappears with everything the outsider brought through it. He looked at the stain beside my shoe. Blood sometimes remains for a few minutes. Clothing lasts longer if it was made here. Not much else does. A branch cracked behind us. Walter turned before I did, one hand moving beneath his coat. A white-tailed deer bounded across the path and vanished downhill. His hand remained hidden for another second. That hesitation frightened me more than the jar. Whatever he believed, he had prepared for violence. I asked how many people he had killed. Walter looked older when he answered. 93 confirmed outsiders. 4 human beings who chose to help them. And 1 mistake I will never excuse. I backed away from him. Walter did not follow. He said the mistake was why he no longer acted without proof, why he kept records, tissue samples, photographs, and names. You do not have to believe me today, he said. But someone already knows you are here with me. Marissa worked 3 floors below the morgue. She saw your name on the visitor log after the accident. 2 nights later, she followed me to this house. That claim pushed through my grief with a new kind of fear. My parents had lived there for 12 years. Their death had brought Walter back into my life. And now he was saying something had noticed. I asked whether the crash had been an accident. Walter's expression changed so slightly, I might have missed it before that morning. His eyes lowered, and his jaw locked. I do not know, he said. But I intend to find out. We returned to the kitchen without speaking. My phone restarted the moment we crossed the lawn. 3 missed calls appeared, all from an unknown local number. Before I could play the voicemail, tires ground over the gravel out front. A sheriff's cruiser stopped beside Walter's SUV, followed by a second vehicle with no county markings. Walter moved to the sink and washed dirt from his hands. Do not tell them about the seed, he said. Watch their faces first. Deputy Claire Harlan entered through the front door after I called permission. She was in her early 40s, compact, rain-dark hair tucked beneath her hat, and she introduced herself while scanning the room, rather than either of us. The second man remained outside the unmarked sedan. Harlan said dispatch had received a disconnected emergency call from my number during the night. I had never dialed. Walter asked what time the call came through. She answered, 12:14. That was the exact minute my grandfather had looked up and waved. Harlan asked whether everything was all right, but her attention stayed on Walter's rolled sleeves, his muddy cuffs, and the back door. When I said I had seen something strange, the deputy's expression did not sharpen with concern. It softened with recognition. Then the man outside lifted a phone to his ear, and Walter whispered, Daniel, whatever happens next, do not let them separate us. Deputy Harlan's hand settled near her holster. Separate you from whom? She asked. Walter smiled as if he had made an ordinary joke. I watched her face, remembering his warning. Concern appeared in the correct places, but it arrived a fraction late, like an actor waiting for a cue. The man from the sedan came inside without knocking. He wore a charcoal coat, no badge, and introduced himself as Calvin Rusk from County Emergency Management. Rusk said the disconnected call had included breathing, breaking glass, and a man saying my name. Walter asked to hear the recording. Harlan answered too quickly. Dispatch already deleted it after logging the incident. I knew enough about municipal software to know that made no sense. Emergency calls were archived automatically. When I said so, Rusk looked at me for the first time. His smile was mild, professional, and completely empty of embarrassment. Walter leaned against the counter, placing himself between Rusk and the hallway. Daniel can come with you, he said. After you explain why emergency management responds to a welfare check before an ambulance. Harlan's eyes shifted toward Rusk. It was a tiny movement, but it established who held authority. Rusk removed one glove finger by finger. "Dr. Mercer, your history makes caution appropriate." The air changed when he used Walter's title. They had known exactly whom they would find. I asked what history he meant. Rusk said Walter had harassed hospitals, threatened public officials, and repeatedly accused innocent people of monstrous crimes. Walter did not deny it. Instead, he asked Harlan whether she still kept a photograph of her daughter inside her patrol cap. The deputy froze. Rusk turned toward her. Walter continued softly. "You showed it to Evelyn when she volunteered at the library. Claire was 6 then. You were 12. Harlan's hand left her holster. For one hopeful second, she looked humanly confused. Then Rusk said, "That is enough," and her expression flattened. Walter kicked the kitchen table sideways, not at either visitor, but across the narrow space between them. Plates shattered. I moved when he shouted my name. We ran through the back door, while Harlan struggled around the table, and Rusk remained perfectly still, watching us choose the woods. Walter did not take the path we had used earlier. He cut left behind the garage, crossed a drainage ditch, and opened what looked like a rusted electrical cabinet bolted to a concrete foundation. Inside was a keypad. His fingers moved quickly, and a section of wall released with a heavy click. We slipped through just as Harlan reached the lawn. Walter pulled the door shut, leaving us in darkness that smelled of cold metal and old dust. Emergency lights flickered on along a descending stairwell. I heard Harlan outside, calling my name in a calm voice. Rusk never called at all. Walter led me below the garage, into a narrow room lined with filing cabinets, medical freezers, and corkboards hidden beneath canvas covers. A steel door waited at the far end. Beside it, a monitor showed 6 camera views of the house, driveway, woods, and the concealed entrance we had just used. On one screen, Harlan searched the grass, while Rusk stood facing the hidden door. He could not possibly see the camera, yet his gaze met the lens. The image trembled with horizontal lines. Walter shut off the monitor. "He is one of them," he said. "Claire may only be helping him." I asked how he knew. Walter touched 2 fingers beneath his jaw. "The same way you know when an elevator starts moving before your eyes confirm it. My body remembers." A dull impact sounded above us. Walter crossed to the steel door and entered a code, but his hand paused over the final key. "Once you see what is behind this door, you will not be able to pretend I am merely sick." I told him pretending had ended when my phone failed beside a pulsing seed. He studied me, perhaps searching for the child he remembered. Then he opened the door and switched on the lights. The room beyond was not a torture chamber. That almost made it worse. It resembled a private pathology lab, obsessively clean, with sealed specimen cabinets, microscopes, and labeled storage drawers. Photographs covered one wall in chronological rows. Each showed an ordinary person beside a second image that could not belong to the same world. Jointed limbs, translucent tissue, mouths opening where no mouth should exist. Dates spanned more than 3 decades. Walter pulled down the canvas covering the central board. At its center was Evelyn Mercer's photograph, taken outside a library with a repaired book in her hands. Threads connected her to hospital records, police reports, and a younger doctor named Conrad Vale. I recognized the surname from a medical foundation that still funded regional trauma centers. Walter said Vale had worked beside him the night Evelyn disappeared, and had comforted him after her body was found. The impact above became a grinding metallic whine. Someone was working on the concealed entrance. Walter opened a drawer and removed a thick envelope, rather than a weapon. Inside were original photographs, laboratory notes, and a brittle evidence label dated October 1989. "I blamed Conrad because grief needed a face," he said. "Then the evidence gave me his." He handed me a photograph of dark tissue trapped beneath a broken fingernail, preserved from Evelyn's body. The image blurred, and the lab lights seemed to recede. Walter's voice carried me backward to the night everything began. In 1989, Evelyn arrived at St. Augustine Regional, carrying dinner for her husband after a 12-hour surgery. Walter was asleep in an on-call room. Conrad Vale was finishing rounds 2 floors below. Evelyn's covered dish was found shattered beside her unlocked car, but she was gone, and no one had heard her call for help. By sunrise, search teams found Evelyn in an abandoned soybean field 10 miles from the hospital. Her injuries did not resemble a crash, an animal attack, or any violence he had treated in war or surgery. One detail survived almost untouched: her long brown hair, carefully arranged away from the blood. As Walter stared at it, Conrad Vale placed a hand on his shoulder and began to smile. Conrad's smile lasted less than a second, but Walter remembered it because no grief touched it. The younger surgeon lowered his eyes and arranged his features into sympathy. At the time, Walter blamed shock. Weeks later, after the funeral, he obtained copies of the evidence photographs and discovered a fragment of black tissue beneath Evelyn's fingernail. The police had logged it as contaminated animal matter. Walter knew no animal tissue that contracted when exposed to human blood. He used favors, threats, and the last of his reputation to secure the sample. The laboratory results contradicted one another. Under one stain, the cells resembled human nerve tissue. Under another, they formed structures closer to fungal threads. The genetic markers matched nothing in the hospital database. Yet proteins on the surface carried traces belonging to Conrad Vale. Walter understood only one thing: whatever Evelyn had torn from her attacker had passed through Conrad's body. Walter began watching him. Conrad remained a gifted physician, generous with patients and patient with frightened families. He remembered every anniversary, donated quietly, and never raised his voice. But when he believed himself alone, the performance stopped. He would stand motionless in empty hallways for 20 minutes, face slack, as if waiting for instructions no one else could hear. Then a nurse would appear, and warmth returned before she reached him. One winter night, Conrad left the hospital after midnight and drove to an abandoned feed warehouse outside town. Walter followed from a distance. Through a broken upper window, he saw 3 people kneeling around a restrained man. Conrad touched the captive's forehead, while the others spoke in low, synchronized phrases. The lights flickered. Every radio in Walter's car burst into static. By the time he reached the warehouse door, the captive had stopped screaming. Inside, the air smelled of hot copper. The kneeling figures scattered, but Conrad remained beside the chair. His face folded inward, as if invisible hands were pressing from both sides. The human outline stretched, split, and reorganized into something taller, narrow through the chest, with translucent limbs bending at too many joints. Walter froze. Conrad's voice came from several places at once. "Evelyn recognized me," it said. "You were never supposed to look." The creature crossed the room faster than Walter could raise his pistol. One hooked limb tore through his coat and opened his side. He fell behind a steel workbench while the warehouse lights strobed. Each flash showed the creature in a different position, but the shadow beneath it always leaned left. Walter fired toward the shadow, not the body. The creature recoiled, and for the first time, he heard fear beneath Conrad's layered voice. Walter used a broken length of conduit to pin the creature against the floor. He did not know what would kill it, only that the left side of its skull reacted when the metal struck. A final impact produced a vibration deep enough to rattle his teeth. The creature collapsed into Conrad's shape. Then Conrad, his clothes, and the blood around him, folded into a dark shimmer and vanished, leaving Walter alone with a ruined floor and a wound that should have killed him. He woke 2 days later in his own basement, with no memory of driving home. The wound had closed to a thin red seam. From that night forward, he felt nausea near certain people, sometimes mild, sometimes violent enough to blur his sight. He tested the sensation for months before trusting it. It led him to another outsider, then another. Each body hit a black seed near the same region of the brain. Destroying it caused the same vibration and disappearance. The grinding above the lab stopped. Present-day Walter raised one finger, and we listened. Silence settled over the basement, too complete to be reassuring. Then, the camera monitor switched on by itself. Rusk filled the screen, standing inches from the hidden lens. His mouth did not move, but his voice came through the speaker. "Doctor, you have kept excellent records. Open the door, and Daniel Mercer will remain uninvolved." Walter unplugged the monitor. Rusk's face stayed on the dead screen. I stumbled backward, and the image turned toward me, with a slow mechanical tilt. Walter seized a metal case from beneath the table and pushed it into my hands. Medical files, photographs, names, everything they fear becoming public. He opened a second exit behind the specimen cabinets, revealing a narrow tunnel. "Take this to the old pump station. I will draw them toward the house." I refused to leave him. Walter gripped my shoulder, his strength startling even after everything I had seen. "Daniel, I have survived because I choose the ground before the fight begins. You do not know this ground yet." A heavy blow buckled the outer steel door. Dust fell from the ceiling. He pressed a small key into my palm. "The pump station is west, beyond the creek. If I do not arrive in 30 minutes, open locker 7. The door bent inward again. Through the widening seam I saw Deputy Harlan's face, pale and wet with tears. "Daniel," she called. "Please do what he says." Rusk's hand appeared beside her head, fingers resting almost gently against her neck. Harlan's expression emptied. When she spoke again, her voice matched his rhythm. "Open the door." Walter's nausea had identified Rusk, but Harlan's terror proved something worse. Not everyone serving them had been replaced. Walter killed the lab lights. Red emergency strips illuminated the floor and the tunnel entrance. He rolled a stainless cart toward the steel door, then scattered specimen jars across the concrete. "They expect weapons," he whispered. "Confusion is more useful." I entered the tunnel with the case against my chest. Behind me, metal tore free from the frame. Walter shouted at someone to get down, followed by a flash bright enough to chase my shadow along the walls. The tunnel descended beneath the woods and ended at a rusted hatch beside the creek. Cold rain struck my face as I climbed out. I ran west through ferns, guided by the distant outline of an abandoned water tower. Halfway there, the metal case vibrated in my arms. My phone died again. From inside the locked case came 3 slow knocks. A pause, and then my mother's voice saying my childhood name. The voice inside the case said my childhood name again, softer this time. Only my mother had called me Danny Boy after I turned 12, and she had stopped when I asked her to. The sound was perfect, down to the breath she took before the second syllable. I nearly dropped the case into the creek. Instead, I locked both arms around it and kept running toward the pump station, refusing to answer whatever had learned her voice. The pump station crouched beneath the water tower, a square brick building with boarded windows and a steel service door. Walter's key opened it. Inside, rusted pipes crossed the ceiling above a dry concrete basin. 7 lockers stood against the far wall. I found number 7 already unlocked. It held a battery lantern, a first aid kit, a compact recorder, and a photograph of my parents standing beside Walter at this same building less than a year earlier. My father looked thinner than I remembered, but he was smiling. My mother was not. She faced the camera with one hand pressed over her stomach, as if fighting nausea. On the back, Walter had written a date 6 months before the crash, and 3 words. Both tested clear. Relief came first, sharp enough to hurt. Then suspicion followed. If Walter had tested them, my parents had known at least part of his secret, and both had chosen not to tell me. The recorder contained 1 file. Walter's voice began without greeting. He said the case carried decoy samples designed to react when an outsider came near. The knocks were not coming from anything trapped inside. They were a signal produced by a damaged seed suspended in a shielded compartment. The voice, however, meant someone nearby was using remembered sound to make me open the case. "Do not trust any voice you cannot place in the room," Walter warned. A floorboard creaked behind me. I turned with the lantern raised. Deputy Harlan stood in the doorway, soaked from the rain, both hands visible. Blood darkened one sleeve. She told me Rusk had gone back toward the house after Walter triggered a chemical fire in the lab. Harlan had escaped through the garage, but she did not know whether Walter had. Her voice shook naturally now. That almost convinced me. Then she called me Danny Boy. I backed toward the lockers. Harlan stopped. Tears gathered in her eyes. I heard your mother say it over the radio, she whispered. It has been repeating since we entered the woods. She pulled the radio from her belt and set it on the floor. Static hissed through the speaker. My mother's voice emerged again, asking me to come outside. Harlan kicked the radio into the empty basin, where the voice continued from below, as if the concrete had swallowed her. Walter appeared behind Harlan, with one hand clamped over his side. His coat was gone, and blood soaked his shirt, but he remained upright. He ordered Harlan to kneel away from the door. She obeyed immediately. Walter watched her for several seconds, then said his nausea was gone. Rusk had left the area. Harlan was human, frightened, and compromised. She admitted the county dispatcher had been feeding Rusk reports about Walter for years. According to Harlan, Rusk never threatened anyone directly. He offered promotions, erased complaints, and knew private things no stranger should know. Deputies who resisted, lost jobs, or family members to accidents no investigation could explain. Harlan obeyed, because her daughter lived 2 towns away, and Rusk mentioned the route she drove to work. Walter listened without judgment. Then he asked whether Rusk had ordered my parents' car watched. Harlan's silence answered before she did. She had seen the vehicle listed in a private alert 6 weeks before the crash. The order did not say to harm anyone, only to report when my parents traveled beyond town. On the night they died, Harlan was off duty. By morning, the alert had vanished. I wanted a name, a license plate, anything I could turn into a human target. Harlan gave me none. Rusk had built the system so every helper knew only the next instruction. Walter sat on the edge of the basin while I bandaged his side. The wound was deep, but the bleeding had already slowed in a way that did not look natural. He noticed me staring. The warehouse changed me, he said. Not enough to make me one of them. Enough to keep me alive when I should not be. He had always treated that survival as an advantage. Recently, it had begun to feel like a countdown. He opened the case and removed a false bottom I had not seen. Beneath it lay a small insulated container. Through its clear lid, a black seed twitched in pale fluid. Walter said it had come from Marissa Cole and should have dissolved after her death. Instead, it remained active and had begun responding to voices, memories, and proximity. That had never happened before. He believed the outsiders had changed how their anchors worked. The pump station lights dimmed. All 3 of us heard tires on the access road. Harlan looked toward the boarded windows. Walter closed the container and handed me the case. He said the station was no longer safe, and directed us through a maintenance hatch into an old drainage channel leading north. Harlan would come because leaving her behind meant giving Rusk another hostage. No one argued. The approaching engines multiplied from 1 to 4. We crawled through the channel as headlights swept across the boards above us. Walter moved last, pausing whenever his wounded side caught against the concrete. The passage opened beyond the water tower, near an abandoned rail spur. A utility van waited beneath overgrown trees. Walter had hidden vehicles across the county for emergencies. As we climbed inside, Harlan asked where we were going. He answered, "Somewhere I can prove the rest before they reach it." We drove west for nearly 2 hours, avoiding highways and speaking only when necessary. Rain faded behind us. Just before dawn, Walter turned onto a service road, leading through limestone hills. A fenced industrial complex appeared below, dark except for one red light above a loading bay. Walter called it his archive, his laboratory, and his prison. Then the red light switched to green by itself, and every lock on the outer gate opened at once. The outer gate rolled aside before Walter touched the control panel. He killed the van's headlights and waited. Nothing moved inside the complex, yet the loading bay light remained green, inviting us forward. Harlan drew her pistol. Walter told her to keep it lowered unless he gave the word. "This place has defenses," he said. "If they have taken control, panic will kill us faster than anything waiting inside." We entered beneath cameras that tracked us without making a sound. The archive occupied a converted pharmaceutical plant built into the limestone. Walter had divided it into sealed zones: records, pathology, containment, and surgery. He explained each area as we passed, not to impress us, but to make sure I could navigate without him. Harlan listened with the brittle focus of someone memorizing a fire exit. Every few steps, Walter paused and pressed 2 fingers beneath his jaw. The nausea was returning, faint but growing stronger. In the records room, hundreds of case files filled steel shelves. Walter showed me photographs from 3 decades of encounters, each paired with witness statements, medical anomalies, and the ordinary life the outsider had stolen. Teachers, judges, paramedics, pastors, and city planners appeared again and again. "They do not choose at random," he said. "They choose leverage." Harlan found Rusk's name on 6 files spanning 20 years, always near missing evidence or unexplained personnel transfers. The deeper we went, the more the building seemed to wake around us. Ventilation fans turned on in empty corridors. Door locks clicked one at a time behind our passage. In containment, 3 reinforced rooms stood vacant, their observation windows dark. Walter said he had once held outsiders there long enough to test sound, heat, chemicals, and electromagnetic interference. No single method worked on every form. Only the seed remained consistent, and even that rule had begun to change. A warning tone sounded from the pathology wing. Walter crossed the corridor to a wall scanner and placed his palm against it. The system rejected him. A second attempt triggered red lights. Harlan checked the nearest camera and found its lens coated from within by a thin black film. Walter whispered that outsiders could not control the entire facility remotely. Someone had to be inside. Then the intercom crackled, and Rusk's voice calmly announced that the building now belonged to its rightful patients. Steel shutters dropped over both ends of the corridor. Walter pushed us through a side door before the final barrier sealed. We entered the surgical suite, where white cabinets surrounded an operating table beneath articulated lights. The room had its own power supply and manual locks. Walter leaned against the table, breathing hard. When I lifted his shirt to inspect the wound, I saw the skin around it tightening in slow waves, as though something underneath were pulling the edges together. He told me the truth he had avoided since the pump station. The warehouse encounter had not merely altered his healing. Years ago, an MRI revealed a seed beside his left hippocampus. It had remained dormant, unable to control him, but impossible to remove safely with the equipment he possessed. Recently, it had started growing. Marissa's seed had changed, because the outsiders were adapting to him. "I am not their hunter anymore," Walter said. "I am their experiment." The surgery had been planned for that morning. Walter had arranged for Dr. Ravi Desai, a neurosurgeon who owed him his life, to remove the seed before it reached the surrounding tissue. Ravi was supposed to arrive through a separate entrance after receiving a coded message. I asked why Walter had not told me sooner. "Because I wanted you free to leave," he said. "And because I was afraid you would look at me the way you looked through that bedroom window." A chime sounded beyond the manual door. Ravi identified himself through the speaker and recited the correct code. Walter's nausea eased rather than intensified. We let him inside. Ravi Desai was a lean man in his 60s, with rimless glasses and a surgical bag already open in his hands. He took in Walter's wound, Harlan's weapon, and my expression without wasting a question. "The building is compromised," Walter said. Ravi answered, "Then we stop waiting." Ravi prepared the suite, while Harlan and I secured the side passages. The operation would require Walter awake only long enough to confirm speech and memory. Then, lightly sedated, while Ravi guided a narrow extraction tool beside the seed. He warned us that damaging it could erase Walter's body entirely. Walter made me repeat the emergency sequence back to him. I hated how calmly he discussed disappearing, as though death were another item to label and store. Before sedation, Walter caught my wrist. "Whatever happens, do not destroy the seed until it is outside me." His grip weakened, but his eyes remained clear. "And do not let anyone take it," I promised. Ravi began the procedure under the white surgical lights, Harlan watched the monitors while I stood near Walter's shoulder, answering his questions about childhood memories. He remembered my first bicycle, my mother's favorite song, and the exact day he taught me a coin trick. The extraction took 40 minutes. When Ravi finally withdrew the instrument, a small black seed rested inside its metal claw. Walter remained on the table, breathing steadily. Relief nearly folded me in half. Ravi transferred the seed into a clear tray and sealed Walter's incision. Harlan left to restore the corridor cameras. I followed Ravi into the pathology room with the tray, too focused on the pulsing object to notice he had stopped speaking. A gun pressed into my back. Ravi's other hand reached around me and lifted the tray. His voice stayed low, ashamed, but firm. Rusk had approached him months earlier, with photographs of his son entering an addiction clinic. One phone call could destroy the young man's career and custody case. Ravi said he had agreed only to deliver Walter alive and preserve the extracted seed. "I never believed any of this was real," he whispered, until it started talking to me. The pathology door locked behind us. I saw Harlan collapse in the corridor as Rusk stepped from the dark with 2 armed deputies. Ravi backed toward the service elevator, holding the seed against his chest. Rusk looked through the glass at me, then toward the surgical suite, where Walter lay unconscious. "You were right about one thing, Daniel," he said through the intercom. "Your parents' crash was not an accident. It was an invitation." Rusk's final word hung in the pathology room, while the extracted seed pulsed inside Ravi's tray. He said my parents had been watched because Walter would ignore threats against himself, but never a threat against family. The crash had brought him home. Grief had brought me closer, and Marissa had been placed near the hospital to confirm our movements. "You were never bait for your grandfather," Rusk said. "Both of you were bait for what he carries." Ravi's pistol trembled against my back. I asked whether Rusk had promised to protect his son, or merely promised not to ruin him. The question landed. Ravi looked toward the corridor, where Harlan lay motionless, beside 2 deputies, who would kill her when she stopped being useful. Rusk's face tightened. "Bring me the seed," he ordered. Ravi took 1 step forward, then turned and struck the intercom panel with the pistol instead. The gunshot shattered the speaker and triggered the room's emergency shutters. Ravi shoved the tray into my hands as one deputy fired through the closing gap. The round caught Ravi high in the shoulder and spun him against a cabinet. Harlan rolled beneath the second shot, seized the fallen deputy's ankle, and pulled him off balance. I dropped behind a steel counter with both seeds nearby, Walter's in the tray, and Marissa's damaged anchor inside the insulated case. Rusk entered before the shutter sealed. His human shape moved too smoothly around the obstruction, shoulders narrowing as if his bones had softened. He ignored Ravi, Harlan, and Walter's seed, his eyes fixed on the damaged container. "Open it, Daniel," he said in my mother's voice. The case knocked 3 times from within. I understood then that Marissa's seed had not been calling for rescue. It had been teaching Rusk how my memories could be used. I opened the case anyway. Walter had warned me never to trust a voice I could not place in the room. But he had also taught me that confusion could be more useful than weapons. The black membrane lifted from the fluid and turned toward Rusk. Every light in pathology dimmed. Rusk recoiled for the first time. I reached into the case before fear could stop me, and the membrane snapped around the cut in my palm. Cold traveled beneath my skin, fast and silent. I felt no second mind, no command, only a sudden pressure behind my left eye, and an awareness of distances that were not measured in feet. Walter lay beyond 2 walls, alive. Harlan burned like a small, frightened signal near the corridor. Rusk was a vast absence shaped around a single hardpoint beside his left temple. He stared at my hand and whispered, "That seed was not meant for you." The pathology door opened from the surgical side. Walter stood there in a hospital gown, one hand braced against the frame, and fresh bandages darkening at his temple. And grief crossed his face, before anger replaced it. "Can you feel his anchor?" he asked. I nodded toward Rusk's left side. Walter did not waste time asking what I had done, or whether it could be undone. Rusk's body unfolded. His coat split along the spine, as translucent limbs pressed through the fabric, each joint rotating independently. His face remained human longest, stretched across a narrow skull, while Conrad Vale's old layered voice joined my mother's. Harlan fired, forcing the creature away from Walter, but the wounds closed as quickly as they opened. Walter pointed toward the nearest containment room. "Daniel, make him choose between you and the seed." I lifted Walter's extracted seed from the tray and ran. Rusk followed exactly as Walter predicted, abandoning Harlan and Ravi to pursue the two anchors he needed. I crossed the containment threshold and threw Walter's seed through the inner service hatch, where it landed safely beyond the chamber. Then I stopped inside. Rusk entered after me, filling the doorway with hooked limbs and flickering human skin. The new presence in my head showed me his anchor pulsing like a black star. Walter sealed the chamber. Rusk struck the reinforced window hard enough to fracture its first layer. I pressed my marked palm against the glass and kept his attention on me. Walter activated a containment cycle designed not to kill a body, but to disrupt the seed's connection. The room filled with a low vibration. Rusk's human memories spilled through the speakers in broken voices. Patience, children, Evelyn, my parents, and finally his own terrified scream. The creature collapsed against the glass. Through its thinning skull, I saw the anchor shudder beside the left temple. Walter increased the cycle for one final second. The seed fractured. Rusk, his borrowed body, and the torn remains of his clothing folded into a dark shimmer and vanished. The chamber stood empty except for shallow marks in the floor. In my palm, Marissa's seed clenched so violently that I dropped to my knees. The deputies lost their nerve when Rusk disappeared. Harlan disarmed one, while the other fled into a locked corridor. Ravi remained conscious long enough to tell Walter he was sorry. Walter answered that remorse was not absolution, but it was a place to begin. Then Ravi looked at the black lines beneath my skin and said removal would be far more dangerous than Walter's operation. The damaged seed had already threaded itself beyond any clean boundary. By sunrise, county and federal responders surrounded the complex, summoned by evidence packages Walter had scheduled for release if the archive was breached. Harlan gave them names, access codes, and a statement tying Rusk to years of obstruction. Ravi survived surgery under guard. Walter's extracted seed remained sealed for study. No official report mentioned outsiders, but enough human crimes were documented to break the local network and reopen my parents' crash investigation. Walter spent 9 days in the hospital. When he woke fully, he apologized for every secret, every absence, and every choice that had placed me near his war. I told him the seed in my head answered one question and created 100 more. I could feel outsiders now, faintly and inconsistently. But I could also feel Walter beside me, alive and unmistakably himself. "Teach me," I said. "Neither of us does this alone, again." 3 weeks later, Walter left the hospital using a cane he finally admitted he needed. We were waiting for the elevator when the seed behind my eye tightened. At first, I sensed one hollow presence below us. Then another answered from the emergency department, another from the pharmacy, and 6 more from offices connected by the hospital network. Every screen in the corridor flashed white. The elevator doors opened, and 12 employees stepped out together, all wearing the same patient smile.